You have precisely 30 seconds to remove yourself from this room before I have the footman do it for you. Cecily Ashworth did not move. She stood in the center of the Marchioness of Belford's drawing room, a shattered porcelain figurine at her feet. Met the cold gaze of the woman who had just dismissed her in front of 11 guests. The figurine had slipped from a side table when Cecily's sleeve caught it while reaching to adjust the curtain the Marchioness herself had asked her to close. 20 seconds of gravity, and 3 years of employment had ended. Lady Belford, Cecily said, her voice level. The table has a cracked leg. I mentioned it in my household report in September, and again in October, and, if memory serves, in a rather detailed letter in November which I suspect was used to line a drawer. A ripple of uncomfortable silence moved through the room. The Marchioness's nostrils flared. She was a woman who wore her authority the way others wore perfume, applied heavily and noticed by everyone. You are a governess, Miss Ashworth, not a surveyor of furniture, and a clumsy one at that. I shall not provide a reference. I am an educated woman who has managed your household correspondence, your accounts, and the education of your nieces for 3 years, Cecily said. She counted the pearl buttons on the Marchioness's cuff without meaning to. 7, she noted, one loose. A habit she had never been able to break, counting things when her pulse climbed. A reference from you would be a curiosity, given that you did not write the last 3 you signed. I did. Someone near the fireplace inhaled sharply. The Marchioness's face went the color of old brick. Get out! Take your things! You will be gone within the hour. Cecily picked up her shawl from the chair by the door. The wool smelled of the lavender she kept in her wardrobe, and the scent steadied her more than pride could. She walked toward the hall with her back straight and her hands trembling only where no one could see them, pressed flat against her skirts. She had savings enough for 6 weeks. After that, London would do what London always did to women without references or family, compress them into smaller and smaller rooms until they disappeared entirely. The front hall was marble and cold. She was reaching for the door when a voice behind her said, "Miss Ashworth?" She turned. A man stood at the foot of the staircase, tall, angular, dressed in black that looked expensive in the way that whispered rather than shouted. His features were hard, as if cut by someone impatient with softness, but his eyes were the color of winter rivers. They were fixed on her with an attention that felt like being read. She knew him. Not from this house, not from this evening. From a library in Bath 7 years ago, where a stranger had found her crying over her father's freshly delivered letter of disinheritance and had sat beside her without speaking for 40 minutes. He had offered her his handkerchief. She had offered him a passage from the book she had been pretending to read. He had smiled, once, and it had changed the geometry of his face entirely. She had thought about that smile for years. He clearly did not remember her at all. "You are Lord Ashcroft," she said. She had learned his name after the fact, from a society column. Lord Edric Ashcroft, Baron of Thornfield. Reclusive. Wealthy beyond easy comprehension, rumored to be eccentric. 7 years older than when she had last seen him, yet he looked precisely the same, which she filed away as peculiar. "And you are the woman Lady Belford just dismissed for the crime of physics," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind that assumed it would be listened to. "I was in the next room. The walls in this house are regrettably thin." "Thin enough for eavesdropping, but too thick for common sense," Cecily said. 7 pearl buttons, she thought again. 1 loose. Steady. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "I have an estate in the Cotswolds, Thornfield. It requires someone to manage its correspondence, accounts, and general state of disrepair. The previous steward left 8 months ago. The position has been difficult to fill." "Because the estate is difficult, or because you are?" she said. The almost smile deepened. "Both, I am told." He produced a card from his waistcoat. Heavy stock, engraved. "The salary is 3 times what you earned here. There is a private cottage on the grounds, and I do not require you to close curtains." From the drawing room came a burst of the Marchioness's voice, sharp and carrying. Cecily looked at the card, then at him. He watched her the way one watches a bird on a fence, still, careful, aware that any sudden movement would end the moment. "I shall consider it," she said, and took the card. She considered it for the duration of the carriage ride to her lodgings, which was 11 minutes. By the time she climbed the stairs that smelled of boiled cabbage and someone else's tobacco, she had already begun packing. Thornfield was 3 hours from London by rail, and another 40 minutes by cart, along a road that seemed personally offended by the concept of maintenance. The house itself sat in a valley, like a creature that had decided to rest and never gotten up again. Stone and ivy and windows that reflected the sky with an opacity that made the whole structure feel watchful. A woman met her at the door. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pinned so tightly it looked structural, and an expression that suggested she had been unimpressed since approximately 1843. "You must be the new one," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Calloway. I keep the house. He told me you were coming, which is more warning than I usually get. Last month he brought home an entire collection of fossils without mentioning it. I found ammonites in the bath." "Cecily Ashworth," Cecily said. "I promise to announce myself before entering any room containing ancient sea creatures." Mrs. Calloway looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, as though Cecily had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. "Good. You have a sense of humor. You will need it. He is in the library. He is always in the library. I sometimes wonder if he sleeps there, except I am not entirely certain he sleeps." The library smelled of beeswax and paper and something older, stone, perhaps, or time itself, if time had a scent. Lord Ashcroft stood by a window that faced west, reading a letter. The light made him look carved from something pale and permanent. "You came," he said without looking up. "You offered me 3 times my salary, and a cottage without curtain duties. I am practical, not proud." He set the letter down. "The estate accounts have not been reconciled in 8 months. The tenant ledgers are in the study. The roof in the east wing leaks, and there is a disputed boundary with the neighboring property that has generated 14 letters, each more threatening than the last." 14 letters, Cecily said. "From whom?" "Sir Rowland Hatch. He owns the adjacent land and believes a portion of Thornfield's eastern meadow is rightfully his. He has engaged a solicitor. He is also," Lord Ashcroft added, turning from the window, "Lady Belford's cousin." Cecily felt something cold settle behind her ribs. "That is an inconvenient coincidence." "I do not believe it is a coincidence at all." His gaze held hers. "Sir Rowland has been seeking leverage against this estate for 2 years. A steward dismissed without cause would be useful to him. A steward dismissed from his cousin's household and then immediately employed here, more useful still." "You think Lady Belford dismissed me deliberately, to create a vulnerability you would fill." "I think Sir Rowland is a man who arranges the board before he begins to play." He paused. "You counted the buttons on Lady Belford's cuff. I watched you do it." She stiffened. "It is a habit. It means nothing." "It means you notice things," he said. "That is precisely what this house needs." Over the following weeks, Cecily discovered that Thornfield operated on a logic that was part institutional and part deeply peculiar. The accounts, once she excavated them from the study, were meticulous up to the point of the previous steward's departure and then collapsed into chaos. She rebuilt them line by line. Working at the broad oak desk while rain tapped against the windows and the fire in the grate burned with a steadiness that never seemed to require tending. Lord Ashcroft was a considerate employer and a bewildering man. He kept hours that defied explanation, awake through the night, absent through much of the day, appearing at dusk with the punctuality of the tide. He ate rarely and only when she was not watching, or thought she was not watching. His hands were always cold when they brushed hers over a document or a ledger. One evening, she found him in the garden at the back of the house, standing among the rose beds that had gone to hip and thorn. The air smelled of wet earth and the last of autumn's decay. "You do not remember me," she said, before she could decide not to. He looked at her. "Should I?" "Bath, 7 years ago, the lending library on Milsom Street. You sat with a woman who was crying and said nothing for 40 minutes, and then accepted a passage from Herodotus as though it were perfectly normal conversation." Something moved behind his eyes, deep, slow, like light through water. "You had ink on your left hand," he said quietly, "and you read the passage about the Nile flooding as though it were the most important thing in the world. You do remember." "I remember the passage. I did not connect it to—" He stopped, looked at her with an attention that had weight to it. "You have changed. I have had 7 years and no inheritance to change me. That is not what I meant." But he did not say what he meant, and she did not press, because the garden smelled of cold roses, and his nearness made her pulse do something she had not authorized. Mrs. Calloway, who had been watching from the kitchen window, said the next morning over toast, "He stood in that garden for 2 hours after you left. I know because I was polishing the silver, and I can see the rose beds from the pantry. 2 hours. In November. The man does not even own a proper coat." "He was probably thinking about the boundary dispute," Cecily said. "He was probably thinking about you. But you are welcome to your delusions. More marmalade?" The letter from Sir Rowland Hatch arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a man in a solicitor's coat who smelled of pomade and self-importance. It informed Lord Ashcroft that Sir Rowland intended to petition the county court for a formal survey of the disputed boundary, and that he had obtained testimony from the former steward, a Mr. Greaves, asserting that the Thornfield records had been deliberately falsified. "That is a lie," Cecily said, looking up from the letter. She had rebuilt those records herself. "The accounts are disorganized, not falsified. There is a significant difference, and any competent surveyor will see it." "Sir Rowland does not need a competent surveyor," Lord Ashcroft said. He stood by the fire, and the flames did not seem to touch his shadow the way they should. "He needs a plausible accusation and a sympathetic magistrate. He has both. He also has your former steward. What made Mr. Greaves leave?" A pause. "I asked him to stop selling timber from the Eastern Wood without recording the income." "Ah." Cecily counted the letters in the solicitor's name on the document. 12. "So Greaves was stealing from you, and now Sir Rowland is using him to steal from you more formally. Elegant." 3 days later, Sir Rowland Hatch himself arrived at Thornfield. He was a stout man with small eyes, and the manners of someone who believed courtesy was a form of currency he could choose not to spend. He walked through the front hall as though measuring it for purchase. When his gaze landed on Cecily, his face arranged itself into something that was not quite a smile. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "my cousin mentioned you, the clumsy governess. I must say I was surprised Lord Ashcroft took you on. Generosity, I suppose, or poor judgment. Your cousin dismissed me for the crime of gravity acting upon a figurine placed on a broken table," Cecily said. "If that constitutes clumsiness, then Newton himself was the clumsiest man in England. 14 letters, Sir Rowland." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You have written 14 letters threatening legal action over a boundary that has not moved in 200 years. That is not a legal dispute. That is a hobby, an expensive one." Sir Rowland's small eyes narrowed. "You are impertinent." "I am accurate. There is a difference, though I understand the confusion." Sir Rowland turned to Lord Ashcroft, who had appeared in the doorway with the silent precision that Cecily had stopped finding startling and started finding interesting. "Control your staff, Ashcroft." "Miss Ashworth is not my staff to control," Lord Ashcroft said. "She is my estate manager, and she is correct about Newton." Sir Rowland left with promises of legal consequences that he delivered with the relish of a man who enjoys threatening people more than he enjoys being right. The carriage wheels threw gravel against the front steps as it departed, and the sound was sharp in the November air. "He will escalate," Cecily said. "Yes." He wants the eastern meadow for the railway easement, the new line from Gloucester. If the boundary shifts even 30 yards, he gains the access rights and the income that comes with them. Lord Ashcroft looked at her. You determined that from 14 letters? From the letters, the county surveyor's records, and a railway prospectus I found in the study that someone, Greaves, presumably, had annotated with projected revenues. She paused. £12,000 a year. That is what the easement is worth. Sir Rowland is not pursuing a boundary dispute. He is pursuing a fortune. For a moment, Lord Ashcroft said nothing. Then, "You are remarkable." "I am thorough," Cecily said. "The remarkableness is incidental. 12,000. But Sir Rowland's next move was not legal. It was social, and it was aimed directly at Cecily. The letter arrived at Thornfield, addressed to the household, and was written in a hand Cecily did not recognize. It informed the local parish council, the magistrate, and, by way of copies delivered to every prominent house in the county, that Miss Cecily Ashworth, lately dismissed from the household of the Marchioness of Belford for incompetence and dishonesty, had been installed at Thornfield under circumstances that cast doubt on the propriety of the arrangement. The implication was precise and devastating. A woman living on the grounds of a bachelor's estate, dismissed from her previous position. The letter did not say anything explicit. It did not need to. Cecily read it at the kitchen table while Mrs. Calloway stood behind her, radiating the particular fury of a woman who has seen enough injustice to recognize it by scent. "That worm," Mrs. Calloway said, "that absolute earthworm of a man. He cannot win the boundary case, so he attacks you instead." "He attacks my credibility," Cecily said. Her throat was tight, but her mind was already working. 9 words in the critical sentence. She counted them twice. "If I am disreputable, then anything I have found in the accounts, the timber theft, the railway prospectus, the annotated revenues, becomes the word of a dismissed, compromised woman, worthless in court." "And what does his lordship say?" "I have not told him." Mrs. Calloway sat down across from her with the deliberateness of someone preparing to say something important. "Cecily, tell him. If I tell him, he will do something about it. He will use his position, his influence, his whatever it is that makes people defer to him the way they do. And then the victory is his, not mine, and Sir Rowland will simply wait and try again when Lord Ashcroft is not looking." "Or," Mrs. Calloway said, "you could let someone help you. Novel concept, I know." Cecily pulled away instead. She spent 3 days working alone in the study, avoiding Lord Ashcroft's quiet questions, eating at odd hours, sleeping badly. The distance was a wall she built with competence and busyness, and she hated every stone of it. He found her on the 4th evening in the study, surrounded by ledgers and copies of parish records. She had not lit a candle, and the room was dim with early winter dark. "You are working in near darkness," he said. "I can see well enough." "No, you cannot." He crossed the room, and she felt the air shift. Cold, then not cold, then something that was not temperature at all but presence. He lit the lamp on the desk, and in the sudden warmth of light, she saw his face very close to hers. His eyes were not the color she had thought. They were darker, with something luminous behind them, like lanterns behind gray glass. "Cecily," he said, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name. "What has Sir Rowland done?" she told him. She watched his face go still, not angry, not reactive, but still the way deep water is still, with everything happening underneath. "I will end this," he said. "No," she said, "you will not. Because if you end it, he wins. He wants to prove that I am nothing without your protection, that I am here because of you, not because of what I can do. If you fight this battle, you prove him right. And if your reputation is destroyed, then I rebuild it with evidence, not patronage." She looked at him. "I need you to let me do this." The effort it cost him was visible. A tension in his jaw, a stillness in his hands that was not natural, not human. She had been noticing for weeks the way he moved too quickly when startled, the way he never ate, the way flowers in rooms he occupied seemed to straighten toward him as though remembering sunlight they had forgotten. "What do you need?" he said finally. "Access to the county records office, a meeting with the railway company's land agent, and Mrs. Calloway's recipe for ginger cake, because I think better when I am not hungry." Something broke in his expression, not composure, but the effort of maintaining it. He laughed. It was a sound like a door opening in a house that had been shut for a long time, and Cecily felt it in her sternum. She rode to the county seat the next morning. The records office smelled of dust and old ink, and the clerk was a nervous man who counted his own pen strokes. She liked him immediately. She found what she needed in the original survey of 1743, the boundary markers, clearly described, placing the eastern meadow firmly within Thornfield's domain. But more critically, she found a record of sale from 1801. Sir Rowland's grandfather had attempted to purchase that same meadow, been refused, and the refusal was documented with witnesses. She brought the documents home. She drafted her counterpetition. She was precise, thorough, and calm, and she allowed herself to feel none of the terror that sat in her chest like a bird in a cage. The hearing was set for a Thursday. The magistrate's court in the village was a room that smelled of lamp oil and damp wool, and it was full. Sir Rowland had made certain of that. He wanted witnesses to her humiliation. Cecily walked in carrying a leather case of documents and wearing a dress she had pressed herself that morning. Lord Ashcroft walked beside her, not in front, beside. Sir Rowland was already seated, his solicitor beside him. Mr. Greaves in the back row looking like a man who had bet on the wrong horse and was beginning to realize it. The magistrate called the matter. Sir Rowland's solicitor presented his case. The boundary was in dispute, the records were unreliable, and the current estate manager. He said this with a glance at Cecily that carried the weight of every rumor he had planted, was unqualified and biased. Cecily stood when it was her turn. She counted the buttons on her own cuff, 5, all secure, and began. "The boundary is not in dispute," she said. "It has not been in dispute since 1743, when it was surveyed and marked with stones that are still standing in the eastern meadow. I have the original survey here." She laid it on the table. "I also have a record of sale from 1801, in which Sir Rowland's grandfather attempted to purchase the same land and was refused." She laid that down too. "And I have the annotated railway prospectus found in the Thornfield study, in Mr. Greaves's handwriting, projecting £12,000 per year in easement revenue from the Gloucester line, revenue that would flow to whoever held the boundary when the railway arrived." The room shifted. Sir Rowland's solicitor opened his mouth and closed it. "This is not a boundary dispute," Cecily said. "This is an attempt to acquire land through legal intimidation, supported by a former employee who was dismissed for theft and has personal cause for grievance. The records are clear. The boundary has not moved. Only Sir Rowland's ambitions have." She sat down. Her hands were trembling. Under the table, Lord Ashcroft's cold fingers found hers, and she held them. Sir Rowland stood. His face was mottled. "This woman has no standing. She is a dismissed governess, clumsy, incompetent, installed in a bachelor's household under questionable circumstances. The court cannot accept—" "The court accepts evidence, Sir Rowland," the magistrate said. "Not character assassination. Miss Ashworth's documents are clear, witnessed, and in order. Your claim is dismissed." The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was the collective exhalation of people who had been holding their breath. Mrs. Calloway, seated in the third row with her arms crossed, said, quite audibly, "Finally." Sir Rowland turned to leave. At the door, he looked back at Cecily with the expression of a man who has been beaten by someone he underestimated and who will never forgive the error. But he left. And that was enough. Outside, the air smelled of cold grass and wood smoke. Cecily stood on the steps of the magistrate's court and breathed, and the trembling in her hands migrated to her entire body and then gradually stopped. "You were extraordinary," Lord Ashcroft said, standing beside her. "I was thorough," she said. "6 documents, £12,000, 1 earthworm. Cecily." He turned to her, and the grey winter light was kind to neither of them and truthful about both. "In the library in Bath, you read me a passage about the Nile flooding. You said the river did not ask permission to change the landscape. It simply arrived, and everything grew. You said you understood the principle. I did not. Not then." He looked at her in the way she had spent 7 years trying to forget and failing entirely. "You arrived. Everything grew. I did not understand what that meant until you were in my house, rebuilding my accounts and arguing with baronets and counting buttons when you were afraid. I realized that I have been waiting for you without knowing your name." People were filing out of the court behind them. Mrs. Calloway was among them. She paused just long enough to say, "If either of you says something foolish right now, I will personally reassign you both to the east wing with the leaking roof." Cecily laughed. It was the kind of laugh that surprised her, that came from somewhere she had forgotten existed. She looked at Lord Ashcroft. Edric, she thought, because formality seemed absurd when a man was standing in a village square telling you he had been waiting for you, and said, "You should know that I am choosing you deliberately and with full knowledge that you have not eaten a proper meal in my presence once, that your hands are always cold, that you do not cast a shadow at noon, and that I saw you move a fallen beam in the east wing that 3 men could not have lifted." He went very still. "Cecily." "The word is vampire," she said. "I am not afraid of it. I have been afraid of poverty and homelessness and the cruelty of small-minded people with social power. I am not afraid of a man who sat with a crying woman in a library and said nothing for 40 minutes because silence was what she needed." "It is not a small thing," he said. "What I am." "No," she agreed. "But neither is what I am. Thorough, remember? I have done the accounting. The numbers balance." He kissed her in the village square, in front of the magistrate's court, with Mrs. Calloway watching and the November wind carrying the smell of someone's chimney fire. It was a single kiss that tasted of cold air and certainty. 6 months later, Thornfield had a new roof on the east wing, reconciled accounts. A garden that bloomed with an enthusiasm that the head gardener attributed to an unusually mild spring, but that Cecily privately attributed to the man who walked through it every evening at dusk. She still managed the estate. She still kept the ledgers. She still counted things when she was nervous. 15 panes of glass in the study window, 8 jars of preserves in the pantry, 3 freckles on the back of Edric's left hand, that she had memorized without meaning to. She had not become passive. She had become partnered, which was different and better. Occasionally infuriating when he rearranged the books in the library according to a system that appeared to be organized by century of publication rather than anything a rational human being would devise. Mrs. Calloway stayed as immovable and essential as the foundation stones. She had taken to setting 2 places at the kitchen table every evening, regardless of whether Edric appeared, because, as she said, hope is a practice, not a feeling, and I will not wash extra dishes for sentiment, but I will for stubbornness. On a Tuesday in May, Cecily sat at the broad oak desk in the study. The windows open to the smell of cut grass, and the late roses that had no business blooming yet, but did anyway. Edric leaned in the doorway behind her. She could feel him there, the way one feels a change in weather, a shift in the quality of the air. "I have been thinking," she said, not turning around. "A dangerous habit. About time. About what it means to have more of it than expected." She set her pen down. The ink was still wet on the ledger page. She had been recording the spring planting, and the numbers were good. "You will outlive me." "Yes. Unless I choose otherwise." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of 7 years of memory and 6 months of knowing, and every counted button, every late-night argument about bookkeeping, every moment in the garden where he stood among the roses, and they turned toward him like creatures remembering warmth. It would cost you everything you know, he said. The daylight, the aging, the way time moves through a human life. You would lose all of it. I would lose you if I did not. She turned in the chair. He was framed in the doorway, and the late light was behind him, and his face held the expression she had first seen in a library in Bath. The one that said he was afraid of hoping. I have done the accounting, Edric. I always do the accounting. The numbers balance. You are certain. I am thorough. Certainty is a natural consequence. She stood. Mrs. Calloway will need to be told. Mrs. Calloway has known what I am for 23 years and has expressed her opinion on precisely one occasion, which was to say, and I quote, "Well, that explains the hours." Cecily laughed, and the sound went out through the open window and into the garden where the impossible roses grew. She crossed the room to him and took his fingers stiff as winter twigs in her warm ones. The last warmth, she thought, or the beginning of a different kind. I have one condition, she said. Name it. We fix the table in Lady Belford's drawing room, anonymously, with a note that says, "The leg was cracked. Regards, Physics." He laughed again. That sounded like a door opening in a house that had been closed for centuries, and pulled her close. And from the kitchen came the smell of Mrs. Calloway's ginger cake and the unmistakable sound of a woman saying to no one in particular, "About time." Cecily leaned into him and counted his heartbeats. They were slow, impossibly, wonderfully slow, and she had already decided she would learn their rhythm the way she had learned everything else, methodically, precisely, and with her whole self committed. "How many?" he said, because he had learned her habit and loved it. 12, she said. Per minute. I shall check again tomorrow. And the day after? And every day after that. She pressed her forehead against his chest, where the slow pulse moved like a tide that had all the time in the world. That is rather the point.